press it. Okay, so as I said before, I'll just start a presentation. Unfortunately, the land acknowledgements were not recorded, but I'll start a presentation and then open up to a conversation. And for this conversation, we will use a Google Doc for people to be able to express themselves, but we also hope to have some conversation in the room as well. So pin my video or spotlight for everyone, and I'll use Prezi for the presentation. Okay. So as I mentioned before, the title of this presentation is Beyond Doomism and Solutionism in Response to Climate Change. And it is an overview of an op-ed that was published during the time of COP27, when we saw that in the current field of climate education, there is this dichotomy between we either promote solutions so that the children are hopeful, or they're going to be hopeless and then fall into what we call doomism, that everything is doomed and nothing else is possible, it's all hopeless. And what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is show how in education focused on solutionism or doomism, they end up in the same place where children are not going to be prepared to face the magnitude of the challenges, the complexity and magnitude of the challenges, and that instead of doomism or solutionism, we should be focusing on preparing children and ourselves as well to repair relations and reweave relations and have the stamina and the stomach for the long haul of this journey of learning to relate differently to the planet. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the work of the Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures Collective, which is a transdisciplinary collective of researchers, artists, educators, students, and Indigenous and Afro-descendant knowledge keepers that works at the interface of, on the one hand, questions related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence, and on the other hand, questions related to the unsustainability of our modern colonial ways of being and related to questions of social and ecological collapse, both the collapses that are possible as we continue on the path we're in, and also the collapses that have already happened for us to be here today. So collapses, social ecological collapses are happening in order to sustain the kind of lifestyles that we currently enjoy, especially in the global north. So the collective brings together concerns related to racism, colonialism, unsustainability, economic instability, wealth disparity, global mental health crisis, biodiversity apocalypse, which is actually the term used by the UN, climate destabilization, and intensifications of social and ecological violence and inequalities. So what we try to do in our work is that we have collective educational and artistic inquiries and experiments that try to build containers, educational containers and artistic containers for the expansion of collective capacity and stamina for engagement with difficult and painful issues without our relationships falling apart and without people feeling overwhelmed, demobilized, or demanding quick fixes and an exit from or escape from the discomfort of it all. So our work is also grounded in the unconscious. So education is generally perceived to be as something that addresses ignorance. We take a different approach based on our collaborations with Indigenous communities, especially in the global South, but also analyses that are coming from the literature on decolonial, Indigenous, and abolitionist studies around the world. And education that addresses ignorance is very different from education that addresses denials. So if you're going to address ignorance, you just present the information and then the problem is solved. But when you're dealing with denial, if you present the image, you are at risk of being shot as a messenger. So in education that addresses denials, we have to go around the defenses of the ego to be able to get people to activate a sense of responsibility from a different space. So the 4 denials that ground the work of the collective are, number one, the denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm, the fact that our comfort, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation. They happen at the expense of other people, other species, and the land, the planet at large. The second is the denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. The third is the denial of entanglement, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land rather than entangled within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of the magnitude and complexity of the challenges that we will need to face together, and the tendency that we have in society and in education to look for simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good, and that they may address the symptoms, but not the root causes of our collective hyper-complex, wicked predicament. And this word wicked is actually used in the literature of complexity science, and we're going to stay a little bit with that word. So in complexity science, system science, we talk about wicked challenges or wicked problems. So wicked problems or challenges are different from regular problems and challenges that can be solved with our current problem-solving approaches, that can be solved with a solution that fixes the problem. Wicked challenges are hyper-complex, multi-layered. They are assemblage of interlocked problems, and every problem is a symptom of another problem. And the solution for one problem in one layer creates problems in other layers. They involve many unknowns, and they have longer and uncertain timescales. So both the climate destabilization and climate education are wicked challenges. And then there are super wicked challenges where time is running out. Those who cause the problem also seek to provide a solution. The central authority needed to address the root problem is weak or non-existent. An irrational discounting occurs that pushes responses into the future. So examples of super wicked challenges are the death of nature, so both climate change and biodiversity loss, inequality, hate and conflict, power and corruption, work and tech, health and livelihood, population and immigration. So these are all issues that are layers that weigh on education. And my argument here is that the kind of education that we have, which is I would call modern and colonial education, because modernity and coloniality are together. There's no modernity without colonialism. It has common assumptions. Now, number one, that talking about negative things makes people feel demotivated, that complexity causes people to feel overwhelmed, that exposing complicities makes them feel uncomfortable, that lack of simple solutions immobilizes people, that uncertainty makes people feel anxious, that talking about the possibility for wider social and ecological collapse can make people feel hopeless or angry. And therefore, we need to make it short, make it simple, make it easy, make it light, make it fun, and make it hopeful. However, this is a catch-22, because if we do that through education, the result is that talking about negative things will make people feel demotivated, complexity will cause people to feel overwhelmed, and so on and so forth. But more than that, what it creates when we are approaching social change is a merry-go-round. And in this merry-go-round, we are stuck in this circular pattern where we will want safe, simplistic, feel-good, and look-good solutions that generally sustain the status quo. We will be looking at marginalized communities, and we will only be able to create relationships that are tokenistic, transactional, and these engagements are driven by optics and consumption. And we will also be reproducing an ethnocentric, narrow and limited imagination of what is possible and desirable. So there's a fortress around our imagination where we can only imagine the continuity and the futurity of the same thing. We can't then imagine beyond that. So we've been thinking in the collective about what it does also to our bodies and our capacity to hold all these multiple layers of complexity. So with this form of education, we carry the complexities on our back. So there's a weight of systemic, historical, intergenerational, and personal complexities that we're carrying, and we're holding the stick with unstable certainties to fend off fear, frustration, resentment, hopelessness, disillusionment, mobilization, isolation, scarcity, and despair. With the winds of climate catastrophe, ecocides, and possibility of human extinction, and intensifications of violence and inequalities, This is not working anymore. And that's why we are seeing a rise in anxiety, depression, and self-harm across the board, not only amongst our youth. So what, if this is also the result of education, how could education also help us out of that? And partly, the work of education is to teach ourselves, who are product of the historical education system, but also young people to take the complexity from the back and develop the muscles of the arms, the back, and the legs to be able to carry the complexity in front of them, to be present to what is beautiful, ugly, broken, and messed up, and without turning away and without drowning in the pain or the sadness of it. So creating the stamina and the resilience to be able to collectively hold the possibility of a different future, but not putting hope in an image of the future, but in the hope, in the repairing and the rebuilding of relationships in the present. So in this way, the climate emergency is not a problem of a lack of technology or knowledge or even morality. It is an impairment of relationships that has led us to the problems that we have today. And in that sense, we make a distinction between mastery education, which is the tradition of education in schools that could be associated with like pouring tea in a cup, where then you measure how much knowledge people have, if they have mastered concepts or skills, or also conquering a peak and feeling the dopamine that we feel when we are over there. So we contrast that with depth education, which is much more about peeling layers of onions. And imagine a truck full of onions and all these layers having to be peeled. We are crying as we peel them, and we have to cook with them for a collective of people. And learning to do that and be in service of that is part of what depth education is about. And in comparison to conquering a peak, this would be much more like deep diving in the freezing ocean and feeling the numbness of the body, the pain, but also the response of the body with heat, and realizing we are water. We're also the water we are diving in, and we are also the toxins we're putting in the water that is making it impossible for life to be sustained within this water. So depth education is a form of education that asks specific questions. And the first question is, how do we prepare ourselves to tackle the wicked challenges of our time, including unprecedented complex dilemmas and also disasters of our own making that we will have to face together? How can we learn to do the kindest and most responsible thing to each other and to the land at all times, especially in times of crisis and polarization? And how can we learn to choose sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in a culture of late modernity that often promotes and rewards the opposite? And I would add, how do we do that in an age-appropriate way? And how do we do that in the school, in the education we receive at school, and in the education that we receive at home from parents? So this kind of education asks us to take steps back. Here we have 5, but you will see that in the chat soon. There will be a link to 7 steps back and 7 steps forward that we invite people to do. But the first step back is the step back from our own selves and self-images to ask, what are we really invested in? What are our fears, insecurities, hopes, and intentions? What does our ego feel entitled and justified to do? How does that limit possibilities for relationship and imagination? And what unprocessed emotions, unexamined desires, and our traumas could be driving our decision making? Because if these insecurities, fears are driving what is possible, then that is very restricted. The second one is the step back from our immediate context and time to try to look at a bigger picture, but understanding that whatever we see in this bigger picture is also bounded by our positionality and where we are looking at it from. Then there's the step back from our generational cohort to see how the challenges are being faced by different generations differently. So we had, for example, a young person who's part of the collective telling us a few years ago that being a young person today was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, while you still wanted the Gucci bag and knowing that this is a scam of capitalism, but not knowing how to interrupt it. So understanding that the different positions and stages of different generations will approach the problem very differently, or experience it and interpret it very differently. Number 4 is the step back from the universalization of our social and cultural and economic parameters of normality. So thinking about what does our privilege prevent us from seeing and experiencing, what are we projecting as universally true that may not be so in different contexts, how these projections become harmful and limit possibilities for relationship building and for coordination, and also asking who could refuse to work with us on legitimate grounds. And number 5 is step back from familiar patterns of relationship building and problem solving that we have been socialized into, and asking what are we accountable to, who are we accountable to, and what possibilities for more responsible steps are already viable, but are unimaginable or unintelligible to us and to those around us. So in some, this kind of education invites us to walk a tightrope, learn to walk on a tightrope where we are trying to avoid desperate hope and reckless hopelessness. Desperate hope is the hope where we project salvation on the chosen people, or a heroic authority, or the right ideology, or a special practice, or a return to a place or time. Whereas reckless hopelessness is about hedonism, I'm just going to live my best life and forget about the rest, or nihilism, there's no point in doing anything, whateverism, whatever goes, misanthropy, which is the hatred of humanity, and the banalization of brutality. So this could be also understood as solutionism and doomism. So we would walk this tightrope with a compass of sobriety, deeper levels of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and responsibility, and carrying a rod where you have intellectual rigor on the one side and relational rigor on the other. And we walk this tightrope with honesty, humility, humor, and hyper self-reflexivity. So honesty is about being able to sit with reality, with what reality is, without escaping into an idealization of it. Humility is about shedding the arrogance ingrained in our institutions, in our society. Humor is because we need a lightweight and we need joy in the struggle if we want to be doing this with integrity. And self-reflexivity is understanding where we're coming from, where we're at, and where we're going. So I will stop there talking about this book, which is called The Hospice of Modernity, that came from the work of the collective. And in the book, there is a further, more encompassing critique of modern education and how it leaves us unequipped to deal with the challenges that are before us, and that also leaves us unequipped to coordinate in ways that can repair the relationships that are necessary for us to, both between ourselves and between ourselves and the earth, so that we can understand the magnitude of the harm that we have inflicted before, but also how to heal and how to find different forms of well-being together. And so here you have the website of the collective, but also of a course called Facing Room and Bronx, which was offered through UBC until last year, but now it's going to be offered through UVic. And in this course, we have had 400 people that have been through the course, and of all ages, basically. And there is a group of parents that have created a small network to think about how to educate children in a world that is burning, basically, right? And how to create in them the resiliency that will be necessary for them to stay in the journey. So that was the reason why I also decided to offer the workshop in this conference. The other reason also is because I, as an incoming Dean of Education at University of Victoria, I will have to be thinking about this in relationship to K-12 and teacher education. And I wanted to open up a conversation where I also have the feedback of parents. So thank you for listening. I will put on the chat the link to the Google Doc and invite you on the chat, on the Google Doc, for the next 2 minutes or 3 minutes to include a question starting with I wonder. So there is going to be a part about I wonder questions from participants. And so I'll give you 3 minutes to do that. And then after 3 minutes, I will ask people to open their mics and their videos to talk about the context where the question is coming from. And then we will see what emerges from the conversation, if that's okay with you. So 3 minutes, and then we're back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Since people are still writing, we'll give it another minute before we come back. Spotlight. I invite everybody to go into gallery view so that we can see each other. But it's okay if you don't want to open your camera as well. And we will do it in popcorn style. So whoever wants to go first and hold and offer the question to be held by everybody. And I'm just going to say, hello, Will. And Steph. No
Sorry,
problem.
Vanessa, would you like a hand up or is
Yes.
that the popcorn? I'm throwing the popcorn. Okay, there we go. Well, first of all, thank you. It's so lovely to see you live. I think I've read, listened to, and transcribed everything you've written or put out since 2006. So if there's like a card carrying fan club, and I love the collective so much. And I'm so inspired by the cartographies and I share them with my grade 11 and 12 community engagement students a lot. So thank you for your work. You're just my biggest inspiration. And of course, Dr. Stein and Pashby and Ahenakyu and everybody you published with. Those you're by far my most cited person. So I go to your work when I feel depressed and it gives me depth and hope. So I was this blabbering on the top here. It's just blabbering. I don't even know if there's really a question there, but given the reality, so I guess I'd just love to hear from your own voice, given the reality of the 4 denials and how difficult those can be to articulate and hold space for and with. I know I've read several descriptions or accounts of you like working with educators or community groups around these 4 denials, and maybe this idea that it's time to hospice modernity, and we are hospicing modernity. I've said for 10 years at least. I know it's not a popular phrase, maybe, that as a K-12 educator, I'm a palliative care worker, really, and I'm okay with that. Seeing my dad die and helping him palliatively into his death very recently, I see how beautiful that is and can be. So I guess I'm just wondering if you could just speak, if you're willing to speak for a few minutes about sort of how you approach those conversations when the denials are up and yet people really want to be change agents. Like, how do you even go into those conversations? I'm curious.
I will ask to put that last question there in the Google Doc. What happens when people want to be change makers and they are still holding the denials, right? And we will have a conversation, but we will try to hold all the questions first and see just what is emerging in the room, because some of the questions may be related to each other, if that's okay. Thank you. So whoever wants to go next.
I'll be completely honest, I didn't know about your work before, so this is all new for me. So, but my question, and I'm very interested, my question comes from more of a classroom teacher point of view in a fairly financially kind of privileged school context, grade 9, grade 10, those ages, middle school ages. So, and I'm kind of thinking about how the complexities of engaging students who maybe don't feel the effects of the climate crisis, or they don't believe they feel the effects, whether because of financial privilege or because they feel like they're far removed from those effects. Like certainly I see that a lot of these conversations get kind of relegated to an environmental club or a particular niche in the school. And so my question is about engaging more students in that conversation without it becoming a kind of niche, or you go to that club at lunch to do those things. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Andrew. It's about sensitizing those who may be buffered from the pain of it, right? Yes,
that's right. That's it.
Okay, thank you. We will just bring more questions in so that you can also speak. Great, and then we'll see. Thank you. Cindy, you're muted.
There we go. Am I audible? There we go. I'll tell you where I experienced the futility of they feel like self-comforting actions, but there is futility in them. We had an alternative to plastic bags in the form of cornstarch 30 years ago. Had we outlawed plastic bags 30 years ago, when we had the technology to do so, we wouldn't be where we are now. And I know we are where we are, but the point is, how do we rally systems to make the big changes? Because I can, in my home, change from a plastic bag to another bag. I can change my habits. I can recycle. I can inspire children to recycle. But when the system doesn't change, there's a sense of futility. And I think that that's part of, even with electric cars now, well, we're just toxifying the earth in another way. And where do they think the electrical charge comes from? It comes from power plants that may electrically generate that using coal and oil. So it just feels like there's a lot of placating going on, and that there are solutions, but they're not bottom up, they're top down.
Yeah, and when thinking about the EVs as well, and all the the price that indigenous people will pay also, because the mining of these minerals for the EV transition will come from further colonialism too, right?
Absolutely. And when we started to change our electric bulbs, they put mercury in them. At a time when we were aware of the fact that we were toxifying the earth. I don't know how to make it relevant when the reality is that the big change agents aren't doing the really impactful things that could actually keep us from the apocalypse.
Thank you, and hold on to that question. We will try to get to that. Thank you.
Okay.
And there's Tanya and Jasmine.
Hi, thank you, everyone. So I'm sure we're all here because we have the intention of doing better and sort of doing some self-reflection. And I'm doing my master's at ISABC in education now, and I've really been looking at leading into classrooms as non-neutral spaces, as political entities that we as educators have some agency to control, or not control, wrong word choice, but to facilitate student agency in building a better world, and still recognizing, yes, there are some challenges that we're facing and it's an apocalyptic situation. And but I wonder about authentically engaging students and for my colleagues of how to recognize we're doing work that isn't neutral, and we can't be neutral on certain things, and to lead with compassion, and our values need to be put forth, and recognizing our positionality and lead with that vulnerable space, which is hard for a lot of teachers. And so I wonder about how to maybe incite some I don't know, shared growth and self-reflection amongst my colleagues. I know it happens at my school. We're all working on it though. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Tanya. Jasmine?
Hi. I think I was wondering, I do a lot of sort of action projects with students, especially younger students. And, you know, like Cindy was saying about the sort of futility of these small actions. And I'm curious about, I don't know if it's changing our definition of what is success for students with these projects, because I think a lot of the time I want students to feel like they did something that made some type of impact, but is it better for them to almost fail at developing an action that makes a difference because they realize that the problem is so complex that, you know, they can't just collect some food for the food bank and that's going to, you know, solve food insecurity or solve poverty? Like, is it better for them to actually fail at that and realize that they can't, you know, just kind of develop this band-aid solution? But then we're uncomfortable with that because we want them to feel like successful, and we want them to feel good, and we want them to feel positive about what they've done, especially when they're younger students. So I guess that's kind of what was brewing in my mind through the conversations.
So how to balance the motivation and the complexity and facing the difficult parts of it. Thank you. Does anybody else want to talk about it? I know that Odette is in a rural area with bad internet, so I'll just ask, do you want me to read your question? And I'll leave it there so that you can have, yes, okay, I'll go back to the Google Doc. I think I know what the question is. Oh, now I lost it completely because there are more questions. Let me find the question. Ay. Where is it? Okay, Odette, can you please highlight your question? Because now I got lost in the middle of so many questions. And I'll give you some time to do that and just open the floor again if there's anybody else who wants to voice the context of their question. Not yet? Found it. Okay, the highlighted question. Question from Odette. I wonder if you think Indigenous-led projects can contribute to the sense of hope versus actively looking for at what needs to be repaired. I asked this question from an Indigenous point of view. And do see patterns of colonial romanticization woven into high-level declarations of decolonization without tangible actions. I appreciate the way you have spoken of repairing relations. That resonates. Thank you. Let me just see if there are other questions, and then we'll start with that one. And I'll just put some thoughts for the conversation, really, and we may have time to do a little bit of another round of further questions or commitments, as you will see in the Google Doc as well. I think Indigenous-led initiatives are extremely important for different reasons. But they can also serve as an escape of settler responsibilities to do what needs to be done on that side as well, right? So I do understand when you say about romanticization of big ideas of decolonization and how this can be interpreted in many different ways and can be a deflection from the difficult work that needs to be done, that is internal, that is intersubjective between us. It's between us and ourselves, between us and each other, between us and other species, between us and the land. And while we carry the layers of complicity and harm through colonialism, through consumerism, through capitalism, in relationship to the planet as well, right? So yes, in terms of the importance of Indigenous-led initiatives, especially of those who are protecting the lands and waters. I particularly work very closely with the Hunikuy people in the Amazon, who actually are also in partnership with the Haida Nation here in what is known as Canada. And they are at the forefront of challenging false solutions to the climate crisis, including carbon markets and carbon offsetting. So what they say is that carbon markets and offsetting, especially the voluntary markets that are imposed in the global south, they financialize and monetize the forest, which already reinforces our relationship with nature and then separation between man and nature. That is actually the cause of the problems that we're facing. That is also the problem of offsetting, that it serves as a license for business to go on as usual and for companies to continue to do what they're doing while paying some people to keep some forests on the ground. It really doesn't make much sense at many different layers. On the other hand, there are compliance markets in the global north that do benefit Indigenous communities here as well. So the discussion is not simple. It is also complex and complicated because it works differently in the global north and the global south. But underwriting the livelihoods of those at the front line of the struggle is actually extremely important, but it cannot substitute or replace the other work that needs to be done in terms of interrupting the harmful patterns we're all complicit in. So we'll start with that. I love the question about whether the students need to see it for themselves. I think that if we prepare them to fail fast and forward and with integrity, that is a different framing of what we invite them to do, right? But what I feel is happening, what you're describing, Jasmine, in terms of setting students up to feel good about something they do, is not going in that direction. Maybe we should say it's all an experiment, and if you are going to fail, because the situation is complex, and for you to encounter that complexity, you have to go through it. But if we promise something that they're not going to get at the end, what tends to happen, and I see it happening at the university, is that courses focused on solutions that promise that technology will solve it in order to keep the students hopeful. Once the students then face the complexity and the failure, they fall. So you build the expectation, and then there's a dive into nihilism. And then in the end, we're reinforcing a fragility, a different kind of fragility, right? And then it has the opposite effect of what you wanted. Like, you're trying to avoid hopelessness, but you're setting them up to be hopeless in the future and not have not be prepared or have the stamina or the capacities and capabilities to deal with that. And that is complicated. In terms of systems and complexity thinking and science, I'm working with critical complexity thinking and science and trying to acknowledge the colonial nature of that science as well, but then also thinking about approaching decolonization, indigenization, resurgence, and climate education through complexity as well. So that means that if you're thinking about Cindy's question, for example, of the bigger picture of this, right now, the generations that are in decision-making positions are not prepared probably to change too much. But what we see also is that I was working with a group, for example, of people working with children of CEOs of oil industries that have created a network to challenge their parents. So it is generational, what is possible. And the people who are coming to, like, I feel I'm in the sandwich generation between those who are still in power. There are chances for my generation to come into power. And that's one of the reasons why I'm becoming a dean as well. Because my generation is very much standoffish and say, okay, I want to have a nice life. I was at the end of the bubble of prosperity. Like, why is this my problem? But then we have other generations coming and saying, you're active, like, and now we're left with this problem. So what I'm trying to do as I come to a position of decision making is to bring the possibility of different choices to the table into education so that we can prepare the next ones who are coming, but without downloading onto them the responsibility for that, right? So now that I had the chance of just being a researcher and just writing and doing field work, I decided to do the work that nobody else wants to do, and offer my time to try to figure out how to, in institutions, crack some codes and open up new possibilities. I think this is possible if we change education towards that kind of responsibility and towards eldership. So that was one of the questions as well that touched that. How do we reorient ourselves from the self-infantilization of our current society that is pleasure-seeking and that wants more and more comforts to an orientation inspired by indigenous cultures that are older cultures. Western culture is very young and wants to remain young, maybe. So how do we invite Western culture to step up, to grow up or grow down, and to show up differently to the world in ways that where education becomes the preparation of people to become good elders and ancestors for all relations, right? How do we reactivate that part of education that has been placated with the super focus on social mobility and producing value in the economies of modernity? In relationship to the students who are buffered from this, I do believe that this buffering is very precarious. But because of this precarity too, there is a sense that I find that sometimes then we want to numb further because we know it's precarious, right? And then there's also further numbing to the pain of others, especially if you've been protected, and seeing privilege, that kind of privilege, as an impairment, right? In a loss of both capacity and possibility and imagination. Desensitization needs to be very wise and very attentive to timing and to process and to context and at many different levels, and will require what I think it was Tanya who brought up, a different kind of teacher education, a teacher education that is actually responsive and attentive to these things as well. And nowadays, the teacher education that we have, the mainstream, is more about delivery right? And ticking off boxes then of actually going deeper into relationality as a pedagogical imperative, right? In not a relationality that coddles the students, but that really is committed to preparing them, with like giving our best shot in preparing them for what's to come, and knowing it's not going to be easy or pain-free, right? So it's in many ways, if we look at both what capitalism, colonialism, slavery has done to us, one way is to look at it as a moral problem, ethical problem. And then in that sense, the response would be, let's correct it and let's find the right solution. The other way is to look at it as a disease and an impairment, right? So we've become impaired, and trying to overcome an impairment is different from trying to correct a situation. And it requires much more compassion, requires much more integrity and dignity in the process of relating to that which is disease both around us and within us, right? Because modernity, coloniality, we talk about this, like colonialism is not the elephant in the room, it is the room. And how do we deal with that? And if we understand colonialism as the driver, the main driver of what's happening in climate, in terms of climate and biodiversity loss, the part of colonialism that imposes the separability between humans and nature, right, is the one that erases the intrinsic value of life, and that makes us feel that to be worthy of being alive, we need to produce value in the economy, in the current economies of modernity, right, and then reproduce colonialism. So how do we figure out how to hack education so that it can help us disinvest in the futurity of that? We might not be able to change everything overnight, but we can visualize some of these aspects and interrupt the satisfaction we have with the current system, and interrupt and help that interruption of satisfaction be widespread. Because a friend of mine, Kesha Heneke, says, colonialism is delicious. Like the pleasurable part of it is the difficult part of it, because if it wasn't delicious, it would have stopped a long time ago. So how do we deal with the fact that we are kind of hooked? And it can be compared to an addiction to the comforts and pleasures and enjoyments, and that these are unsustainable and violent, and they will be taken away from us at some point, or if it's not happening already. So how do we prepare for that? And that's why the title of the book is Hospicing, which is about a gradual disinvestment as we attend with integrity to what is dying, as we invest in the relationships required for what is gestating. So we give prenatal care for something, for this baby that is going to be born. But in this prenatal care, we do not suffocate the baby with our own projections that are coming from the old system, right? So how do we prepare the whole family to receive this baby in a very different way, from a very different space? Was there any other question that came up that I can remember? So vulnerability, I think the question of vulnerability and learning to walk with honesty, humility, humor, and reflexivity towards deeper forms of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability is really important, but not as form, not as points of arrival, but as inquiry. So an inquiry on discernment doesn't arrive at a specific point. It's a continuous, lifelong, and life-wide journey that requires also resilience and stamina, right? We are not going to get to a formula or to a universal solution. We'll have to keep rethinking this, and we will need to find joy in that. We will need to figure out a different form of well-being where we're not overwhelmed by these things, and where we face life, death, and the pain and the loss and the grief and the joy and the wonderful things together with the terrible things with a heart, a collective heart that can take all that. And right now, our hearts have been individualized, and the collective pain that we have to face does overwhelm the individual heart. And I think partly what we do need already in terms of support of practices that we can see in Indigenous communities that point to the fact that there are other possibilities of well-being, and I'm talking neurobiologically. Currently, our well-being is associated with dopamine, oxytocin, with endorphins, and with adrenaline sometimes, mostly. But there are practices of relationality and of land, of being land, recognizing our bodies are land, and what we do to the land, we do to our bodies, that require discipline in a different relationship with pain and with the self, but that can open up a different neurobiological chemical cocktail that gives us the stamina and the resilience and the joy in the struggle, so that we can stay with the trouble and we can weather the storms, we can compost the shit, metaphorical and literal, that we need to compost together, and find joy in being together doing it, not just go for the cheap pleasures of what we consume, right? So yeah, I think that's what's coming at this point. So what I will invite you to do, because I know we have only 5 minutes left, I'm sorry I spoke so much, but I will ask you to go back to the Google Docs, and instead of, because they had asked us in the conference to talk about action points, but or commitments. I do not think that's probably the best way to wrap this up today. I will just ask you to put there what's alive for you at that for you after this presentation. And if you want to open up a mic and talk a little bit about that, that's the opportunity to do so. So thank you.
Thank you.
So open mic, anyone who wants to say something, see what's alive, and if you want to add or question or sing, you're welcome.
Vanessa, I just wanted to say thank you for talking about relationships as a pedagogical imperative. That really stuck with me as something I've been thinking about for years, not just checking the boxes. I feel there's too many boxes, and I don't feel there's enough focus on that essential growth of understanding who we are and developing the courage and safety to develop as an individual. And I think I work in a middle school, and to me that's my job. That's the essence of what gives kids a foundation to, or as you say, the resiliency that they need to face the future. And that to me was extremely powerful and made me feel supported, I guess. So thanks a lot for that.
Can I say one thing as well? I've been trying to use rest as some slight resistance doing, I don't know, not following like quiet quitting, but I get really jazzed and invigorated with students who have these moments of epiphany. And I find that it happens when they're outside and when they're quiet or when they're still. And then that gets my creative juices flowing. And so I appreciate days like this, that it's really been a productive, active. And you can see my little one, a couple of them came in at numerous points. So they keep me humbled too, because of all the things they are excited by. And I want to keep that excitement alive, but with a critical responsibility for all of us. So thank you.
I always feel really like liberated in conversations like this with other educators, like that people are choosing to make the time to talk about these things that are these big ideas and be able to sit with them. Because I think so often as teachers, it's the like details, it's the assessment, it's the planning, it's the what can I take back to my classroom. And I find these kind of conversations like the most transformational. And yeah, it's just so great to be in that space and have those things be asked and be said, and that there's not necessarily like a solution or a point or a particular goal that we're working towards. It's just saying these important things.
Just want to say in response to Tanya, like one of the things I could have said is that the joy comes in the chain of epiphanies, right? Rather than the arrival somewhere and the dopamine that you get when you achieve something. There's something else that happens in the depth of things, and that is extremely important for us in the pathway towards eldership too, in the ability to embrace more and more responsibility, which is the path, and that's in that way rather than less and less.
I think for me, one of the things that I find that as the discussion becomes more complex and more wordy, it becomes more abstract. And I think that this is a very concrete challenge that has to be faced. I also think that there's a hubris within mankind. We think that the way to solve this problem is to invent a new technology that may turn carbon dioxide into our oxygen. And my students always come up with, I'm going to come up with that technology. And there is one. We have that technology. And not only does it turn carbon dioxide into oxygen, it cools the planet and provides homes and food, and we've got trees. A return to simplicity, I think, is part of it, is realizing that, is developing the humility to recognize that our planet has been around for 4.5 billion years. And it's been very successful until we came along trying to solve its problems with technology. And one of the things that I think we can do for our kids is develop critical thinking and ask them to look at the technologies that are being developed and asking them to challenge them and see if there are more simplistic ways that we can learn from nature rather than tell nature how it's done.
Thank you, Cindy. On that note, there is a link to critically informed, complexity-grounded climate education. It's a project that's being led by Sharon Stein at the University of British Columbia that speaks to what you're talking about too. I put that in the Google Doc, but I know that we are over time already, so I want to respect everybody's time and thank everybody again for being here today. I hope our paths will cross again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.